going to move.
So nothing is going to change, you
Right,
say?
right. Nothing's different.
No, it'll be left in a greater state of confusion.
Right.
Hello everybody. Welcome to the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad in Wyoming. Today is July 3rd, 2022, and this is Layout Construction Update number 32. I'm Mark Pruitt, Burlington Route Casper Division Superintendent. This past month saw progress on the Wind River Canyon and the addition of Wi-Fi to my NCE DCC system. I also celebrated the second birthday of the layout with a video. Shame on you if you didn't watch it. I had the first real operating session on the layout too. Not that limited operations test from back in March, but a real operating session with a 4-man crew. And I began experimenting with making sagebrush. Let's take a look at it. Wind River Canyon looked like this at the end of May. Not too bad for the dead of winter maybe, but it would look even better in a zero visibility blizzard at this point. In early June, that 50-pound bag of hydrocal I'd been waiting for finally arrived. First order of business was to empty that paper bag and store the hydrocal in plastic containers. Then I got started. I added some brown, dry tempera pigment to the hydrocal plaster so blinding white wouldn't show through any thinness in the final ground cover. I mixed the first batch with water and painted it onto the side of the mountain at the south end of the canyon. I just did the one batch that first day, so I wouldn't have too big a mess to clean up if the tempera pigment ruined the plaster. The hydrocal set up overnight just fine, so the next day I continued on, adding several batches of plaster to the mountainside. I found that mixing up about 1.5 cups at a time is just about the right amount to be able to paint it on the mountainside before it starts to set. Things were going well, so I decided to try my hand at making a few rock walls. I made a mold out of aluminum foil and filled it about 1/4 inch deep with black tinted hydrocal. After the plaster started to set, but while it was still flexible, I slapped it onto the mountainside at the south end mouth of Black Tunnel. I sprayed water on the mountain first to wet the plaster. I let the casting harden in place for about 15 minutes while I busied myself making another somewhat smaller mold. Then I peeled the aluminum foil away from the first rock wall. Hey, this doesn't look too bad. I was certain I would fail on the first few castings. I applied the second casting on the wall just inside the tunnel and peeled the foil away after allowing it to sit for about 15 minutes. This is what I wound up with after about 90 minutes of work. This looked pretty good, but it wasn't quite good enough. That ledge on the wall above the rocks is a road that should run right out over the tunnel. Here's what that area looks like today, 75 years after that road was abandoned. Clearly I needed to trim down the rock wall and lower the ledge to more closely meet up with the top of the tunnel. I marked the rocks with a Sharpie so I'd know where to cut it, then went to work with a utility knife. I've read that hydrocal is very strong and hard, but I had no experience with it until now. What I've read did not exaggerate. It took me half an hour to cut through that rock wall and the side of the mountain. Even the very thin layer I painted on the mountainside took some effort to cut, but in the end it looked like this. I didn't have any more plaster cloth, so I soaked some paper towels in hydrocal and applied them over the wound. Then I painted on several more patches of brown hydrocal, working my way past the north end of Black Tunnel. Then it was back to making more rocks. This time it didn't go so well. I made the mold too large. It seemed to have stuck onto the mountainside just fine, but when I peeled the foil off, a lot of that rock wall broke up. That's not a big problem since I'll need a lot of talus anyway, so all those broken off bits will be saved and used later. I learned my lesson though, make the molds a bit smaller. On the 17th, I pressed ahead with more rocks below the roadway. When I was done with work for the day, I had this. I'm not too concerned with the different hues in the rocks, since they'll be stained and painted later, and the rocks in this area vary greatly in color anyway. Remember the photo of the real canyon? I also used a bit of plaster from that last mold to do some repair on the rocks above the tunnel. A bit more work and it will be fine. On the 18th, I painted more hydrocal onto the mountainside. I'm up to the south end of Tunnel 4 and can't go farther because from this point northward, I only have one layer of plaster cloth in place. I need to add the second layer before proceeding with the hydrocal. Backing up to earlier in the month, I haven't been happy with the performance of my NCE radio system. Too many dead spots and missed commands even in areas where the radio seems to be working. Rather than fight those problems by adding NCE radio repeaters, which could get costly, I decided to add a Wi-Fi interface to the system instead. In mid-May, I ordered a WFD31, a Wi-Fi adapter made by Wi-Fi Tracks, a company in Australia. The unit is a direct plug-in replacement for one of the NCE UTPs, their universal throttle panel. It arrived on June 10th. By the way, Iron Planet Hobbies sells the Wi-Fi Tracks products in the US, but they were out of the WFD31 when I ordered mine. It took all of about 15 minutes to install the adapter, and most of that was reading the instructions. True to their word, it's a direct replacement for the UTP and fits in the UTP faceplate. The only requirement is to enlarge the LED hole in the faceplate to provide clearance for the WFD's LED. Once installed, I turn on the system power. The WFD31 fired right up. You can tell it's powered by the bright purple glow of the LED. The WFD31 works with the Engine Driver app on an Android phone, or with Wifi Throttle on an iPhone, or with a TCS Wi-Fi throttle. I have Engine Driver on my phone from using it at the club, so I just connected to the WFD31's Wi-Fi network and loaded Engine Driver. Connecting it to the WFD31 network was easy. I could now run trains on my layout using the app on my phone. Here's the WFD31 while in use. Note how the LED flickers green when it's receiving commands from a throttle. That way, you know it's working. I had an operating session on June 25th, which I'll get to in a minute, and two of us used our phones with the Wi-Fi, while the other two used my NCE throttles. The Wi-Fi was rock solid all over the train room. The control systems, both the Wi-Fi side and the NCE throttles, all worked great together. I'm going to put together a more in-depth video about how I install the Wi-Fi adapter on my layout and how well it works. That should be out in the next few weeks. June 25th of 2020 was the day I started construction on this version of the layout. On June 25th of 2022, I published a second birthday video. The link is in the description if you'd like to see it. Now about that operating session. After the success of my operations test back in March, I was ready to hold a real session. Dave, the guy from Basin I met through this channel, a friend of his from Grable named Sean, Kurt and I spent the day together here in Casper. We started with a visit to Kurt's layout, which Dave and Sean had never seen. Afterwards, we went to lunch at Wyoming Ale Works, then headed over to my house for the operating session. No, the house isn't for sale. This is a picture of the house from when we bought it in late 2019. Dave, the retired professional railroader, had the dubious honor of being the Casper yard operator. Sean ran the Thermopolis local, and Kurt handled the CNW train. I run the through reefer trains and the passenger trains, whose primary purposes are to get in everybody else's way. Dave even brought his RunCam 2 with him, and we tested it out on my layout. Here it is following the westbound Reefer Express from Casper to Thermopolis. The focal depth is certainly better than my Osmo Pockets. Everyone enjoyed themselves for several hours into the late afternoon. Having a group of folks over to run the layout as if it was a real railroad is very satisfying. It really brings the layout to life, even if very little of it is really complete at this point. By coincidence, the operating session was on June 25th, the layout's second birthday. I didn't realize that would be the case until a few days before the session, but what a fitting coincidence. I'm going to plan for another session for sometime in September. With luck, part of Worland will be operational by then, and maybe even Douglas. We'll see. There was one casualty of the session, the decoder in my Doodlebug. I was running the Doodlebug with a trailer as the passenger train to Thermopolis when it split the switch at Showbon. When the Doodlebug derailed, it fried the decoder. That's never happened before. You can see the burnt component in this shot. A replacement decoder is on order. On June 28th, I drove to Thermopolis to take photos for the backdrop for my Thermopolis model and for the area between Thermopolis and Worland. I'll use the photos I took to build a backdrop like I did for Casper. There's one more thing this month, sagebrush. Sagebrush is ubiquitous in Wyoming. That is to say, it's all over the place. I'm going to need plenty of it for the layout, so on my way back from Thermopolis, I stopped just south of the Wind River Canyon to take a few photos of the foliage in the area. How am I going to replicate this stuff in miniature? Following a suggestion from a member of the Model Railroad Hobbyist forums, I bought a small block of florist foam that seems to be a close match to the silvery green sagebrush leaves. I chucked it in a blender and ground it up into fine particles. I made branches for the sagebrush out of a small bit of sisal twine that I dipped in Hunterline weathering solution and glued on the ground up florist's foam. Not bad for a first try. I need to kill the glittery look of the foam, but an overspray of matte medium should do that very well. I have to make huge quantities of this stuff in all different sizes. I'm sure they'll get better as I go. And we come to the end of another update video. I have continued work on the sidem structure. I hope to have it completed during July. I'll continue working on the scenery from Powder River into the canyon, and I'm going to continue building rolling stock and structures. Expansion of benchwork and track into Worland and Douglas might begin in August. Thanks for watching, everyone. Stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you next month.